Hi there, I'm Peter McCormack. I am the host of the What Bitcoin Did podcast. I'm here to interview my good friend John Pfeffer, covering the second session of supporting the developer ecosystem landscape. How are you doing, John?
I'm wonderful. How are you? Feeling better?
I'm good, buddy. Good. Yeah, feeling a lot better. Back's fixed. Ready to talk to you. Everything's good.
Good.
Ready to do this. And do you know, I've known you for probably 3 to 4 years now. And one of the things I didn't realize about you straight away was how much support you actually give to the developer landscape begin with. And that became more obvious later on as I got to know you more. And I just think it'd be a really interesting place for people to start is for you to talk about your background and interest and your investing thesis, but why with Bitcoin that has given you this imperative to support the developers.
So, I'm an entrepreneur, and I have built different businesses in different industries. And as the years, decades have gone on, we also, as a family, are more and more active investing across all kinds of risk assets globally. And when we first encountered, well, let's say, first encounter with Bitcoin was 2011, and frankly, it was just a little bit too hard for folks like us, I think, to get our heads around. But I had the good fortune of having coffee with my friend Vincent Casares in 2016, and he explained Bitcoin to me in very simple terms that I understood. Um, it reminded me of all of our venture investments, which are, at the time, look, um, money is a ledger for keeping up with what we owe each other. Bitcoin is a better technology for that ledger. It'll probably fail, but if it works, it'll be very valuable. And I said, well, that sounds like all the other venture investments we make. And that framework was enough for me to say, well, we're going to make an allocation and we'll figure it out as we go. And I've talked about it before it was a ready, fire, aim investment, something that because it's liquid, you can take a position and then evolve it as you go. That was in 2016. And then if you remember it all, the whole Bitcoin and everything else started going up into 2017. And as that happened, I had to dig in and learn more because it was growing as a position, and I needed to understand what we owned and what we should do with it. And it became one of the things that hit me was, and this was probably maybe Q2 of 2017. It was that, well, this is a piece of software. This is free open source software, and that's really critical. Who's developing it? Who's writing the code? What happens? What if something goes wrong? Where is it going? And a mutual friend, organized a dinner with me, John Newberry, and Matt Corallo, both of whom are well, John is speaking in this event, and Matt works at Square now and has been a key Bitcoin developer for a long time, along with John. And I remember at the time I was coming from a business environment and saying, well, so what's the product roadmap for Bitcoin? Tell me where, I want to see the product roadmap. What are we going to, where's Bitcoin, how is it going to develop, over what time frame, who's doing what, who's responsible? And they said, no, John, you don't understand. That's not the way it works. It's open source. Everybody works on what they want to work on. It's even somewhat adversarial in terms of how changes are made. We have to get consensus. And my initial reaction, coming from a normal sort of business mindset, was, what a mess. This is not a way to get something done quickly. But then, in the summer of 2017, and then with all of sort of the last 3 quarters of 17, we got into the block size wars and the forks and everything else. And won't sort of rehash all of that there, but it was a learning process for me to really understand not only how important development was, but also the risks and how essential it is that Bitcoin development is consensus based. It's hard to make changes to Bitcoin. That Bitcoin developers are free to pull in different directions. That there are multiple diverse developers, multiple diverse funding sources, and 17 was a pretty brutal time. And come December, we'd just been through this really uh, tumultuous year, and I was sitting there saying, "My gosh, I really have to understand the development landscape better and the community, and make sure that it's that if to the extent I can contribute, we can make it contribute to being healthy. And healthy, I had understood by then meant again diverse funding sources that didn't get in the way of the developers, that didn't tell them what to do, and so forth. And Adam Back sent around an email suggesting the Great Scaling Initiative. And basically, we had this big war over block size, and block size was being used very inefficiently. And there were known practices that just simply hadn't been implemented by some of the big users of block space, and that needed to be implemented. He says we ought to set up an initiative, get a couple of people to help educate some of the biggest users. And obviously, we're talking here about exchanges and so forth on how to most optimally use block size, block space. And I picked up on that. I said, well, that sounds like a really interesting. Remember, I was still learning about all of this and didn't really know where to support and how to do it. And I said, well, that sounds really high impact and super important. So I forwarded the email. Both Vinces Casades and I were on this list, but I said, hey, Vinces, why don't you and I support this? Why don't we offer to fund this? And he said, great. And so I answered back saying, well, Vincent and I are going to fund this. Now what? And then it was crickets, because someone had to step up and say, I'm going to lead this. And a couple of months went by, and John Newberry stepped up, and that was the origin of Bitcoin OpTech. And that was kind of how it all started. That was the process. Was I went through this discovery of coming in with a very different mindset of how it, in my mind, ought to work, and really learning that no, in fact, it shouldn't work like I had in mind at the time, some kind of product roadmap and some kind of centralized top-down thing. And on the contrary, we needed a diverse developer ecosystem with different funding sources, and just set out to try to contribute to that.
Well, I'm also a contributor to dev funding at a much lower scale than you are, but it's always felt like a voluntary tax for supporting the network. That's how I've always felt it is. A lot of people from the outside might be following these sessions, John, and not realize that their imperative exists throughout the Bitcoin ecosystem. Whether you're somebody who just holds a very small amount of Bitcoin, or you're an exchange, or you're an investor like yourself, but there is that imperative to support the network, because you do have skin in the game owning Bitcoin. But you clearly have that imperative. You felt like you should support the network. But can you talk a little bit more about why this means other people should be considering it as well? Because there are risks of not having enough developers.
Absolutely. Well, if you care about Bitcoin, there are different reasons to care about Bitcoin. One is because you believe in the movement. Another one is because it's an investment. Or it could be both. You again, it seems to me fairly obvious that actually the heart of the issue is making sure this piece of software is stable, secure, and evolves, in a constructive way. I would argue it's kind of obvious that from a risk perspective, it's obviously the biggest risk. The biggest risk is inside. The thousands and thousands and thousands of lines of code that are being maintained and updated and so forth. God forbid something goes wrong, and you need a robust system to make sure that the way changes are made and so forth is well, again, extremely robust, and that Bitcoin moves forward, but in a very deliberate way. And I think it's inherent to Bitcoin as a store of value. Protocol stability and a very deliberate development process is essential. But it seems to me that for all those reasons, it's obvious that if you care about Bitcoin, it's in your interest to contribute. And then the question is how you want to do it. And there's so many different ways. And in some regards, I think, well, actually, I wouldn't even say in some regards, I think absolutely the diversity of opinions, the diversity of ways to do it, the diversity of sources adds as opposed to detracts. The fact that even different supporters may have slightly different tacks, that's healthy.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point because one of the big newer contributors to raising funding for open source development on Bitcoin has been the Human Rights Foundation. And they
Right.
specifically focus on issues relating to privacy. Big shout out to Alex Gladstein for everything he's done there. When I first started to become aware of this was a couple of years ago. I went down to Chain Code Labs in New York and I interviewed John Newbery. Interestingly, I also met three of the residents there. One of them was Carla. I spoke to her again today for the first time, which was amazing. She's now working at Lightning Network, working on LND. One of the interesting things, though, is since then we now have Brink, which is based in the UK because Chaincode is New York, but we also have the HRF. We have all these different strands of projects. It isn't just core; it is the Lightning Network, or it is privacy, and I think that's what you're talking about there, right?
Absolutely. By the way, I was remiss in not mentioning Chain Code earlier when I talked about Bitcoin Optech because John was working at Chain Code, and they very kindly made him available. And Chain Code are have been sort of the models for anyone who's supporting Bitcoin development for a long time. But you're absolutely right. I mean, in terms of really high impact, easy ways, I think those are some, Human Rights Foundation, and it's a charity. Anyone can contribute. Brink as well. I mean, when I say a charity, it's a U.S. registered charity for folks for whom that's relevant. Brink is also a U.S. registered charity. It's fairly straightforward. You can understand what they're doing. There are a few other organizations. There are other ways, like you can directly sponsor developers. We do that in a couple of cases, both on an ongoing basis or grants. That takes a little bit more. You have to be reasonably plugged in order to kind of know where to go and how to do it. And I obviously rely on the network that I built up. And Yeah, I mean, I think the more approaches, the better, and the different angles. Human Rights Foundation on human rights, as you suggest, in privacy and so forth. Brink adding a non-U.S. dimension, frankly, to a community that was a little U.S. heavy historically, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, wouldn't it be great if we had a similar organization to Brink in India, one in Australia,
Totally.
maybe one in Northern Europe? But if we could spread the developer landscape, that's so much better for Bitcoin because we are trying to decentralize everything. We're trying to decentralize
Absolutely.
nodes. We're trying to decentralize mining. So if we can have some big investors come in and try and support networks such as Brink being built up in different locations, that's only going to be good for Bitcoin.
Absolutely. And by the way, again, like John Newberry's example, when he raised his hand to say, well, I'll do Bitcoin Optech. There's we need more funding, but then we also need developers or leaders like Alex, like John, et cetera, to step up and go and do something, and then attract the funding to do it. It'd be wonderful if we saw that across in other geographies around the world. I think in fact, and often I think it's someone stepping up and saying I'll do it is maybe the scarce resource.
I also think one of the other interesting things, just harping back to what I mentioned about meeting the residents at Chaincode, and then I've interviewed Amiti since, I've interviewed Carla again today. When I met those, they were just enthusiasts who were interested in the Bitcoin network. It isn't that there is a network flush with developers are appropriate. One of the important models is also finding people who might be interested in Bitcoin and training them up.
So that's a really good point. There's a whole bunch of things to say on that. First of all, it's important to remember why do we need sort of philanthropic development of Bitcoin development? Because first of all, they're an incredibly talented group whose who have all kinds of great options, and and frankly they're doing it because they're passionate about it. But they still, you know, not all of this, you know, some of them maybe bought some Bitcoin very early on, but most of them, or a lot of them, especially newer ones and younger ones, need to pay the rent, and and are willing to sacrifice, but need obviously support to meet them halfway. And I think you're touching on something that's interesting about renewal. The you know, there, in a given year there are a few hundred developers who contribute uh, to Bitcoin in some concrete way. You know, a few dozen, say 30, 40, are in any given year are probably doing most of what is happening in that year. But that shifts over time. You know, there is turnover, there is an evolution, and I think it's very healthy in that you have key developers who are involved in the project for a number of years, but there's sort of steady renewal, and that's essential. And also, as part of decentralization, is also that renewal. You know, if you don't want to necessarily have the same people forever. And one of the things that we did we've done in that regard. Well, a couple of things. First of all, again, John Newberry at Brink has been great about onboarding new developers into Bitcoin. We also there's a training program that Jimmy Song did, and we funded bursary scholarships for a couple of years ago for female developers and that led to some great newcomers to the system. And that's another thing you can support is I mean, Brink is one good way to do it, or these kinds of things to train up and recruit new developers to the system.
Well, that's also important because one of the things I've learned, John, traveling the world with Bitcoin, is that sometimes you can think of Bitcoin essentially with the blinkers on, based on the geography of where you live. Me as an investor in the UK or perhaps a US investor thinks about Bitcoin in terms of the usage they would have. But I've traveled to many parts of South America. I've traveled out to Asia. And if you're in El Salvador, your use case for Bitcoin is going to be very different. You're going to primarily be using Bitcoin on the Lightning Network. You may have a different scenario for thinking about your own security. You perhaps can't create a multi-sig wallet and distribute keys into different locations and safety deposit boxes. By having a diversity of developers, we also get to understand about the needs of people in different locations.
Absolutely. And you know, Bitcoin, as we're seeing, for example, what's happening in El Salvador and so forth, I think is tremendously important for everyone, but important in different ways, in different parts of the world based on different needs. And it's really important that the developer community reflect that.
I also think it's important to start thinking about the diversity of the backers. I think for a long time, perhaps we relied primarily on chain code or the work that was being done at Blockstream, but that's very US centric. I think we need a diversity of backers from across the ecosystem. Also, perhaps maybe one huge backer at some point would pull out, and what would the impact be on funding? And the more decentralized that the funding that comes in for developers, the better. So we don't have any of those single points of failure for the money that's coming in to support the developers.
Absolutely. No, I couldn't agree more. But we're seeing, I mean, it's such a different picture than it was in 2017. We've made so much progress, but we need to keep it up.
I mean, I guess that's my pitch to say if anybody out there is holding a large amount of Bitcoin and they aren't supporting the network, it's time to get out there and, and write some checks and support them, people. Another thing that might be interesting with this session, just because of the title of the session, John, there might actually be developers or people who want to be developers who are thinking, you know what, I like this Bitcoin thing. I'd like to dedicate my time to it. Yeah, I can go to Google and earn $300,000 a year, but this feels like a better project for me to get involved in, and perhaps I can stack some stats while doing it. what would your recommendation be to developers who are thinking about, look, I want to get into this, but I don't know how to pay my bills. I don't know how to pay my rent with this because I don't understand how it works.
Well, so I'll answer, and I suspect there my answer will be incomplete, but I'll give a few
Hmm.
ideas. One is it's a very welcoming community. The Bitcoin developer community is very welcoming. It is internally demanding, right? Because it's defending an incredibly important monetary network, and it holds itself and its community members to high standards, thankfully. But it's incredibly welcoming, and so to begin with, just start interacting with the community of developers. It's an open, if you're constructive and want to learn and are keen to be helpful, um, you'll find you'll find help in the community. Number one. Number two, more concretely, you mentioned Chain Code Fellowships is a terrific um, on ramp. Brink and John Newbury, what he's doing there, I know, is a terrific on ramp. And I'm sure there are others and of course, once you're involved, you can then there's an ecosystem of grants and so forth that you can plug into. But I'm sort of going before that in terms of how do you learn, how do you get started, how do you figure out where to contribute, and sort of find your place. One other thing that I would say, you know, it one of the great ways to contribute to Bitcoin that we always need more of is code review. It's less glamorous than having your own commit, but it's incredibly important, and that's a way that you can get started is trying to just be constructive and helpful in terms of reviewing code and making comments. Again, I think you'll find the developer community to be quite welcoming.
Well, code review is so important because we have a system here where we can't have any chargebacks. If you make a mistake or there's an
Right,
error, we all
right.
risk losing our money. So, I mean, it's
Right.
probably one of the most important jobs in the ecosystem because bugs can be critical. So, okay, another area I wanted to ask you about. You've been quite close to the developers for quite some time and how they're funded. How have you seen that evolve over the last 4 to 5 years?
Well, so as I said, we've got tons of new things. So we didn't like what did we not have? So I guess 4 or 5 years ago, as you pointed out, there was in terms of the major polls, there was chain code, Blockstream, all this fantastic, MIT DCI, um, and um, you had obviously some independent developers. You had some developers employed by companies like Zappo, Ventus's company, and so forth. Um, and that's continued, but now we have many more developers being funded by exchanges, and to work on Bitcoin, to work on what they want to do, whether on the payroll or through grants. But we also have Human Rights Foundation, we have Brink, we have Bitcoin Optech, different focuses, and and others. I mean, there. I mean, I don't. It's not an exhaustive list that have sprung up. And I think that combination of new organizations with just more grants going on from companies in a lot of the grants, and then the organizations are often very philanthropic, um, is a lot better. And I think you put your finger on it. If I had to, there's so many different ways it could go, and frankly, part of the point is everybody should find their own way, and no one should dictate it. But if I personally had to say what I love to see now develop would be more more brinks, more chain codes, and so forth in different geographies, with different perspectives.
Well, it's an interesting evolution, right? From an original group of uh, decentralized developers to some kind of structure around those, to having essential charitable institution managing devs, to onboarding people, to now distributing those around. But there's even an imperative just to talk about it. I mean, if I make a show about funding developers, it would be one of my lower performing shows because people don't really want to hear about that. They want to hear the moon talk. But I even feel like I have an imperative not just to contribute myself, but to even talk about it. To have John Newbury on the show, I'm actually going to be doing a re. What happened is when I interviewed John at Chainco, did a 15-minute interview with Amiti, who you probably know,
Yes.
Carla, and Fabian, the three of them for 15 minutes. They're all now working on Bitcoin development. So we're going to do a reunion show, and they're going to be talking about their experience. But I feel like us podcasters, the journalists, everybody in the space has a duty to cover this, to make it a topic that never leaves, that would never. Because John, the real question is how. What is the maximum amount of funding we need for developers?
Wow. Gosh, that's a, how long is a piece of string? That's a really good question.
Exactly.
I think, interestingly, there's probably a balance. Bitcoin, I mean, in theory, so Bitcoin, protocol stability is really important, right? I mean, sorry, I didn't mean that in that. Without a doubt, protocol stability is very important, and therefore, in theory, there is an upper bound to just how much change you want and how much time, and therefore how many different inputs, and as a consequence, maybe somewhere how much funding. I don't think we're there. I mean, I think that we're still in a place on the curve where more um, more funding and more developers, especially more, increasingly diversity developers, geographic and otherwise, would be um, would be would be beneficial. But there is an upper bound. I don't think it's, interestingly, it doesn't take crazy numbers. It's not like we need 10 times more would be my guess. I mean, I think get 10 times more. I don't know. It could even be counterproductive. It's not an order of magnitude of increase, but we need to maintain what we've got, and we could probably, I don't know, double it, triple it, but
That's
and
interesting because
productively without things getting out of control. Sorry.
I. But that's interesting because I thought you'd say there's never an amount, there's too much, but perhaps you're right. And
Well,
another thing I would just
yeah.
I mean, another thing I would say is interesting, just as somebody who's made small donations myself, is that it's given me an imperative to learn more about developers and development, and ultimately, therefore, increase my knowledge of Bitcoin. And I'm assuming it's done the same for you.
That's, well, for sure. I mean, I've learned so much through getting to know developers and what they're working on, following their work. The whole point of it is I don't, I have no influence on what they do, but I learn so much, and it gives me a chance also when I don't understand something. I know who to call. I can say, can you explain this to me? Why is this important? What does it mean? And it's incredibly enriching, and it's just a fascinating. There's so many. Bitcoin is fascinating, and
Hmm.
the more you get into the detail, actually, the more fascinating it gets.
Yeah, I can agree, I can agree more. Yeah, the last 5 years of my life have just been the most incredible journey of learning, and I take a long time to learn these things. I also think it's quite funny after knowing you for 3 to 4 years. This is the first time I've actually interviewed you, John, which is
I know.
hilarious.
We've been talking about it.
I can't believe. I
We've
know,
been
and here we
talking
are.
about
Well, listen, look,
it. Here we are,
we're
finally.
getting close to the end of close to the end of the session. If you wanted to say one last thing to, who've got skin in the game, they've got Bitcoin, they've never actually supported the ecosystem of developers yet. You want to say one last thing to them and point them in a direction? Let's do that now.
Well, I would say, well, first of all, just like getting off zero with Bitcoin is the first step, right? You know that owning zero Bitcoin is the wrong answer, and then it's a question of scaling. And similarly, I think if you care about Bitcoin, whatever your focus, um, development is key. You should, I think, seriously consider making a contribution. If you know how to code and you're passionate about it, maybe do it as a developer. Or if you know how to code and you feel like you want to organize something, go start up a chain code or Brink India, et cetera, as you suggested. If, like me, you don't have any particular skills or talent, but you have the ability to provide funding, get started. And I think the easiest way to do it is via the organized charities, that some of the which we mentioned earlier. And through that, you'll begin to learn and network, and find your way around. And as you do that, I'm sure everyone will find her or his own way to focus, and who they want to support and so forth. But that's probably the easiest thing to do out of the box.
Cool. Well, I'll finish off a little bit more direct. If you've got big Bitcoin funds, especially if you're a company in the Bitcoin space and you're not
Yes.
sponsoring developers, you really need to pull your finger out. If I'm giving more money than you, then that's an embarrassment. Pull your finger out, support developers. And I also think, look, check out Brink because they are newer. Check out a Human Rights Foundation, Alex
Absolutely.
Gladstein, because they're also newer. They're doing some great work. John, always love seeing you. Hopefully, I'll see you again in person this year, and appreciate your time in this. And also, look, just a massive thanks for everything you've done for Bitcoin as well, and the money in to support developers. And appreciate you, man.
And thank you for all you're doing, and glad to see you back on your feet.
Thanks, brother. Cheers.
Take care.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.